I would like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Thomas SCHLAAK, who is a partner and global sector leader for power, utilities and renewables at Deloitte Consulting. Thank you very much for waiting, and thank you very much for being with us today. We're looking forward to your presentation on the future of the European power market in 2050.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well.
We can hear you very well, yes.
And it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you about the future of the European power market, or at least what we at Deloitte see as potential scenarios for that market. I have quite a challenge, because I want to present to you our study in the next 10 minutes. Quite comprehensive, complex study, but nevertheless, I will try. So let me share my presentation and take you relatively quickly through our analysis of the European power markets. So you should be seeing the presentation by now.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so let's start the ride. We've been doing these studies for quite a while, but in the last 2 years, you will agree that a lot of things have happened in terms of the EU, the COP decisions, and then with the Ukraine war also. The response from the EU, the energy crisis, market design questions, and then also inflation and interest rates sort of doing their thing, with further international regulations sort of getting into place. So we said we need to redo our study. We're using for this study a very comprehensive model for the European market, which is not only modeling the power market, but also the demand sectors around it, so that we really get to a consistent view. At least that's what we believe. Obviously, there's assumptions around, but that's the way it is. So what we've did is we've been modeling the European Union, including the UK, including most of also Eastern Europe, except for the Balkans. We've been doing this with 4 scenarios. All of these scenarios, as you can see on the lower graph, sort of will reduce CO2 emissions, but not all of them to the same extent, and not all of them in terms of what is required by the European Union. So we believe the 2 determining factors are sort of geopolitics and determination and cohesion of the European Union. We see 4 different scenarios: a green independent scenario where we have tensions. The European Union stands together and is focusing on sort of especially the renewables build out. Open clean tech is a scenario where we're more cooperative, also across the world, importing and exporting more technology, also being able to rely on material flows from outside the European Union. And we also see a growth before climate scenario where sort of economic pressures in the European Union sort of apply, and then dispersed abatement where more maybe the richer countries in the European Union drive the energy transition, whereas others stand behind. So as a result, we've been then modeling this with sort of different variables in terms of the holistic economic context, but also with regards to the energy system. And as a result, we see abatement of the CO2 emissions in the European Union as defined, sort of happening in all the scenarios, but only on the scenarios on the right-hand side, we will actually get to a net zero scenario, which requires also negative emissions. Still on the sort of, let's say, more conservative scenarios, there is a decrease of CO2 intensity between 70–80%, which is absolutely significant. What is in common with all the scenarios is that the demand for electricity is increasing dramatically, not only on the right-hand side scenarios, but also on the more conservative scenarios, especially towards the end of the study period. Our modeling then reveals a generation mix, which is in all of the scenarios dominated by renewables, wind and solar, but obviously has different nuances in terms of the role of natural gas and other forms of electricity. When we look at the production volume in those scenarios, you see that nuclear still plays a role, gas still plays a role. Gas plays more of a role in the left-hand side scenarios, and wind and solar is dominating in all of the scenarios, and even more so on the ones where that thrive and do actually get to the CO2 reduction. When we look at the differences between the European countries, they are quite large. So each dot represents the carbon intensity of a European country. And as you can see, we start off with quite a divergence of CO2 intensity, which narrows down, but in the end, we will not have the same setup in all of our countries. Some of the European countries will have to compensate through negative emissions what other more energy intensive and CO2 intensive economies still emit. When we look then at the evolution, how the CO2 intensity is developing, we see in all of the scenarios a greening. Now that is different in terms of the timing. Some of the Eastern European countries take a little bit more time, especially on the left-hand side scenarios. What will be a dominating and defining factor in all of the scenarios is the peak-off-peak spreads that will increase as you would expect. But the magnitude of that increase is actually quite big. So we would get to net load variations of up to 700 gigawatt within a few hours in a stress week, let's say a winter week that we used here for illustration purposes, which will require obviously flexibility, more flexibility in the system. Our analysis reveals that the flexibility stack is not so dissimilar across all scenarios, so there is room for more than one technology. We clearly see grid level batteries as an important source of flexibility, but most importantly, gas-powered turbines are required as backup capacity in the mix going forward, especially in the left-hand side scenarios. This will be a determining factor and technology. As a result, we believe that the merit order is changing or continues to change as it has in the last 10 years. So we see more and more must-run capacity in forms of renewables entering the merit order. The price setting, let's say, part is getting more steeper, and this will result in a price curve that we believe will look something like this. So what we did here on this graph is that we've been cutting out the 10% extreme price points that our modeling reveals and only look at the interval between 5 and 95% of the price distribution, you see that given more moderating gas prices, that the price peak that we've been experiencing last year is fading out, that we get to a price level on average prices around 90 euros or so. Now, this is average European prices. Obviously, the country by country situation can be quite different. But in the different scenarios, the price spreads, so the volatility is actually quite different, right? So we believe while the average prices don't deviate that much, the scenarios to the right, which rely on a lot of flexibility, see higher volatility. That's why we also see sort of procurement strategies for energy changing, PPAs being signed long-term in order to avoid the exposure to this price risk. Let me conclude with sort of a final slide in terms of how a typical or the average generation mix in Europe will evolve. This is sort of two scenarios that I picked here. On the left-hand side, you see the green independent scenario, which is banking a lot on solar and wind plus flexibility capacity. You see that while nuclear keeps its place, coal is being phased out relatively quickly. Whereas on the right-hand side, in terms of the open clean tech scenario, we have a similar development of the generation mix, still with natural gas plus CCS staying as a backup capacity, and really the wind technologies plus solar providing most of the capacity. With that, I stop here again. Maybe three key things that I would say one could take away from this. One, in all of the scenarios, the transition is happening towards renewables, towards electrification, towards decarbonization, to a very large extent. Maybe not 100%, but to a very large extent. Secondly, there are significant differences across countries. So Europe is not sort of behaving all the same, which will require a single European energy market and solidarity between the countries in order for Europe as a whole to actually get to its targets. And the third point I would make is that obviously, given the scale of this, the key issue next to scaling the supply chain is financing of projects. So preserving the positive economics, the positive fundamentals to the right prices is really important, while also the balance sheets of the investors have to be strengthened. It's clear that debt financing will not be enough in order to motivate all of these projects. So further forms of equity and capital needs to be applied. Thank you very much.
That's really great. Thank you very much for taking the time to participate in this, for presenting the results of your modeling. I must say I very much liked the more unique approach to scenario design that you've taken. I think there's some very valuable insights that we can draw from your presentation. I will first open up the floor for questions from the participants here, if there are any. If there aren't, I have a couple. I've seen some snippets on some of your slides, but if it's all right for you to elaborate a bit on what is the difference between the different scenarios in the role of fossil gas for the power sector. I'm saying this because Romania is planning to invest quite significantly in large CCGT capacities. Sometimes I think that without sufficient attention being given to actually how they would fit within the electricity system. So I'm just curious, not just in terms of magnitude, but also role. Are these peakers that are suitable for for matching peak demand? Is there any sort of baseload production towards 2050 that's envisioned in any of the scenarios? So could you please elaborate on the role of gas in the power markets moving forward, please?
Yeah. Again, I would say that the differences country by country are quite big. So please take my comments as European average comments. So what we see is in our modeling that the operating hours for CCGTs is declining, and that's you've been seeing in the final chart where on the y-axis we had the load hours, which is progressively sort of coming down, which means that while there still is a role for gas-fired power generation, we don't believe that sort of balancing a system without gas turbines, gas peakers is possible. The amount of gas that will be burned in those plants is declining over time. Now, that is obviously also a question of the gas price that you assume here. So obviously, the lower the gas price, the more operating hours you may seek. Yeah, but still, sort of given that sort of in the future, and let's say the 2040s, the system will be dominated by wind and solar. Even that would not help that much in terms of the utilization of gas-fired power plants, as sort of solar and wind are, are always more cost competitive. In a short run basis. Obviously, this assumes that we keep our market design intact that we currently have. Now, there's big debates that we should change that in terms of capacity prices, etc. Introducing that in more and more countries. And yeah, I guess that discussion is also triggered by these kind of analysis.
Thank you very much for the answer. Just another question, if that's all right. I've seen on your slide abatement first, offsetting later, which I was very happy to see. But I have also heard you saying that negative emissions are required to different degrees between scenarios. So I'm just a bit curious, again, in terms of magnitude, but also types. So what sort of, are they natural sinks? Is it BECCS? What sort of negative emission sources are you relying on in your modeling?
The model relies mostly on DAC, so direct air capture technology that would really sort of become somewhat significant in the 2040s. And in one of the scenarios, even in 2030s, we would start to see some of that capacity. Now, this is again under the assumption that the European Union is driving towards reaching the commitment that was given through the COP process. And hence, we believe when we want to reach this, sort of negative emissions are required, and direct air capture seems to be one of the more promising technologies.
Very clear, thank you. Well, we hope we'll have low electricity prices for that, because that's a big factor in DACs.
It is.
If there are no other questions from the participants, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time for the presentation, for answering my questions. I hope you can make the presentation available for the participants as well, because it was quite information rich, and I think, yeah, it merits some further analysis. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And again, please excuse that I bombarded you with all of this data, but I wanted to, yeah, at least sort of give you a first insight and impression in terms of how we at Deloitte think about sort of the energy transition.